Welcome to the Pardish channel. Today we explain Prophets Judges chapter 10 in a clear and simple way, step by step. We're going to really break down this amazing text, exploring the historical events exactly as they unfold, and pulling out some incredibly practical life lessons that, honestly, still resonate today. Right now, we're picking up the story right after a period of intense, bloody, internal violence in Israel, specifically the disastrous reign of Abimelech from chapter 9. The nation desperately needs some stability, and you know what? That's exactly where our story begins.
Here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll look at the minor judges. Second, Israel's great rebellion. Third, God's initial rejection. Fourth, true repentance in action. Fifth, the impending battle. And finally, we'll hit those practical life lessons.
Okay, part 1, the minor judges, the calm before the storm, covering verses 1 through 5.
Let's dive right into the text by checking out the first 5 verses. They establish a vital baseline of relative peace. And that number, 45, it represents the combined years of leadership under 2 consecutive leaders, or minor judges, Tola, who led for 23 years, and Jair, who took the helm for 22. Verse 1 tells us that after all that chaos with Abimelech, Tola, the son of Puah, the son of Dodo, from the tribe of Issachar, rose to save Israel. If we stick to the simple meaning, the Peshat of the Hebrew text, the names here are actually pretty fascinating. Tola translates to crimson or worm, while Puah means something splendid or brilliant. Now, even though he was from the northern tribe of Issachar, he lived and judged in Shamir, right in the central mountainous hill country of Ephraim. This geographic detail, it shows his influence was widespread. He provided steady, quiet leadership for 23 long years. Then, after he passed away and was buried in Shamir, Jair the Gileadite took over.
So Jair, hailing from the Gilead region on the eastern side of the Jordan River, judges Israel for 22 years. And this guy was a man of serious status, prestige, and wealth. The text explicitly tells us he had 30 sons who rode on 30 donkeys, and they actually controlled 30 towns in Gilead. Now, in the ancient Near East, riding a donkey was a massive flex. It was a distinct mark of nobility. Horses were mostly for war, right? So leaders riding donkeys vividly points to a sustained time of peace and prosperity. These 30 towns became known in Hebrew as Havoth Jair, which literally translates to the tent villages of Jair, or the encampments of Jair. It really paints a picture of a flourishing, settled society. For 45 combined years, a whole generation grew up knowing nothing but structure and peace. But as soon as Jair dies and is buried in Canaan, this rare generational calm just completely, suddenly unravels.
Moving right along to part 2, Israel's great rebellion, the descent and the consequence. This is verses 6 through 9.
Now, verse 6 outlines the massive, unprecedented scale of Israel's pivot to idolatry right after these leaders die. They didn't just casually slip up or make a small mistake, they completely abandoned their covenant. Just look at this sweeping list. They entirely forsook the Lord, adopting a shocking 7 different foreign gods from surrounding nations all at once. They worshipped the Baals, which were local Canaanite storm and rain gods, and the Ashtaroths, goddesses of fertility. Obviously, for an agrarian society totally dependent on crops, the temptation to worship weather and fertility deities was huge. But they didn't stop there. No, they brought in the gods of Aram from the distant northeast, the gods of Sidon to the northwest, gods of Moab and Ammon to the east, and gods of the Philistines to the southwest. I mean, this wasn't just a localized error. It was a total 360-degree geographic and spiritual surrender to the idols of literally every single neighboring nation.
And well, this brings us to the devastating consequence of those actions. Because they forsook God and stopped serving Him, the text tells us God's anger burned against them. He sold them into the hands of the Philistines and the Ammonites. To put this in perspective using the simple context of the Tanakh, divine protection is often likened to a physical covering or a shield over the nation. When Israel completely rejects God, He doesn't necessarily have to send an active, aggressive punishment. Instead, He simply lifts that covering of protection. By removing His presence, He naturally sells or exposes them to the exact same hostile predators whose gods they had just chosen to worship. It's like they wanted to belong to the surrounding nations so badly, and now they're entirely at their mercy.
18. That is the number of agonizing years the Israelites were severely oppressed as a result of this abandonment. Think about that. That's a massive, crushing span of time for an entire generation to suffer. The text specifically notes that the Israelites living on the east side of the Jordan in the land of the Amorites, in Gilead, were just entirely shattered and crushed. But things got even worse, because the Ammonites didn't just stay on the eastern side of the river. They actually crossed the Jordan to fight against the major central and southern tribes of Judah, Benjamin, and Ephraim too. The oppression was completely suffocating. Israel was in absolute, overwhelming distress from every conceivable side.
Which brings us to part 3, God's initial rejection. The confrontation, covering verses 10 through 14. So, the crushing weight of those 18 years of oppression brings us to the emotional peak of the chapter. Israel finally breaks. They cry out for help, offering this standard verbal confession, saying, "We have sinned against you, forsaking our God and serving the Baals." But God does something unexpected here. He confronts their cyclical hypocrisy. He doesn't just immediately accept their words. Instead, he lists 7 specific historical times in the past where he miraculously rescued them. He lists the Egyptians during the foundational Exodus, the Amorites on the east of the Jordan, the Ammonites, the Philistines, the Sidonians, the Amalekites, who were their perennial enemies, and the Ammonites. Notice the exact deliberate parallel here. Israel chose to worship 7 foreign gods from the surrounding nations, so God reminds them of 7 distinct, miraculous rescues that they have just completely ignored and forgotten.
Then, God issues this absolutely striking rejection, challenging them to rely on the false idols they worked so hard to acquire. He tells them, "You have forsaken me and served other gods, so I will no longer save you." It's this moment of profound, sorrowful, tough love. He's essentially telling them to look at his historical track record of deliverance versus the track record of the pieces of wood and stone they now worship. If you believe in these foreign gods so much, let them deliver you from your current distress. Let the gods of the Ammonites save you from the Ammonite army.
All right, part 4, true repentance and action, the turnaround. Let's look at verses 15 and 16.
Now, the crucial point here is what Israel does next to prove their repentance isn't just empty lip service. They realize it's simply saying, "I'm sorry," just isn't going to cut it this time. The situation demands a profound, structural change. So, they level up their apology by combining 3 vital steps. First, they reiterate their verbal confession, owning their fault. "We have sinned." Second, they move into unconditional submission. They surrender control entirely, telling God, "Do with us whatever you think best, but please rescue us now." And third, and absolutely most importantly, they engage in physical action. They didn't just apologize, they completely got rid of the foreign gods from among them and actively began to serve the Lord.
And wow, this tangible, physical action sparks a profound shift in the divine response. The literal translation, the simple meaning from the Hebrew text, tells us that God's soul was grieved, or that he became impatient, over the misery of Israel. He literally could no longer bear their suffering once their actions finally aligned with their words. Their physical removal of the idols proved their hearts had actually changed. This beautifully highlights that true repentance isn't just about appeasing an angry deity, it's about genuinely restoring a broken relationship. Once the obstacles to that relationship were removed, God's deep compassion was immediately stirred.
Moving to part 5, the impending battle, the cliffhanger, verses 17 and 18.
Let's look at the final verses and see how this sets up the historical narrative. The spiritual crisis, it's been addressed, and Israel is right with God again. But the physical, military threat is still very real, and it's standing right at their doorstep. The Ammonites are called to arms, and they set up camp right there in the territory of Gilead. In response, the Israelites assemble themselves together and camp at Mizpah. Now, the name Mizpah in Hebrew translates to watchtower or a high lookout point. This paints such a vivid picture of the geography. The Israelites are gathered at the high ground of the watchtower, looking down at this massive Ammonite army camped in their own backyard. The sheer proximity of these two forces means a massive, brutal battle is entirely unavoidable.
So the leaders and the people of Gilead look around at their gathered army and ask this absolutely critical question. They have the troops and they've removed the idols, but they have no commander. Who is going to lead them? They make a solemn promise that whoever is willing to launch the attack and lead the charge against the Ammonites will become the head over all the inhabitants of Gilead. It leaves the chapter on a highly dramatic, suspenseful cliffhanger. The question just hangs thick in the air. Who will step up to save the nation now that the stage is set?
Finally, part 6, practical life lessons. Let's talk about what we learn and how to improve ourselves.
Before we wrap up this explainer, let's extract the universally applicable life lessons from the simple meaning of this incredible text. Because the historical events of Judges chapter 10 aren't just ancient history, they provide a brilliant psychological blueprint for how we handle mistakes and rebuild broken relationships today. The central takeaway here is that true repentance requires far more than just acknowledging a mistake. Acknowledging a wrong is literally just step 1. True repentance demands physical, transformative action to remove the root cause of the error. We saw Israel try the first method, right? Crying out for help while secretly keeping their idols. It simply didn't work. It wasn't until they unconditionally submitted and physically removed the toxic elements from their lives that real healing and restoration could actually begin.
Whether in our personal relationships, our workplaces, our communities, or our spiritual lives, this brilliant chapter illustrates that accountability is both collective and individual, and it requires real, sustained change. When you break trust, your words are pretty much meaningless unless the other party can physically observe a shift in your behavior. You can't just say you're sorry. You have to remove the actual cause of the offense. You really have to clean house.
So think about your own life. Are there empty words you're speaking right now that desperately need to be backed up by real, transformative action? What negative habits or distractions are you secretly holding on to while simultaneously asking for a fresh start? To move forward, you absolutely must discard the idols holding you back. Thank you for learning with us. If this helped you understand the chapter better, like, subscribe, and join us for the next chapter.